Okay, so what is Linux? Well, Linux is an operating system, and I'm sure that you're already familiar with a computer operating system such as Microsoft Windows that I have running behind me here, or Mac OS if you're more of an Apple person. Those are both computer operating systems, and they're quite popular. Linux is also popular along with Unix. And it's important to say that Linux is a Unix-like operating system. As a small point of clarification, Linux was designed by Linus Torvalds in 1991. And it was actually inspired by Andrew Tannenbaum's Minix. Minix was also a Unix-like operating system. But it's important to know that Linux, which was inspired by Minix, which was Unix-like, Linux actually doesn't contain any Minix or Unix code. Unix as a legal entity, Unix as a proprietary piece of technology is patented and is going to be closed source, at least in most applications and in most uses. Okay. Unix started way back in the early 1970s at Bell Labs, and Linux was just introduced in 1991. So that's a little bit of the history there of Linux. It's a computer operating system. It's Unix-like because it was inspired by Minix, which was a Unix-like operating system. But even in 1991, if you go back and look at the history, Linus Torvalds said Linux was completely free of Minix code. So it really was its own thing, its own operating system, inspired by Minix, and therefore it is Unix-like. Now, you don't need to know anything about Unix. You don't need to know anything about Minix in order to understand Linux. Linux is going to provide a different user experience than Mac OS or Windows, but you will find that it's fairly similar, at least when you have the desktop variety. We're going to be looking specifically at a Linux server, and so we're not going to have any graphical user interface. Just let that sink in a little bit. If you don't have experience working with computers where you didn't have a graphical user interface, you're going to be much more intimately involved with what the computer is doing. You're going to be issuing the commands. You're going to have to know the commands that you can type into the shell. And we'll talk more about what the shell is. But I think operating a Linux server is going to give you a better chance to understand how a computer works. And you might say, I really don't care how a computer works. I really just want to get the skills I need to succeed on a job where I need to know how to operate a Linux server. And let me tell you, the more you start thinking like a computer, I know that sounds weird, but the more you start thinking like a computer, the more you'll be able to do with a computer. Understand that computer operating systems exist because you can't just say, hey computer, would you pull up google.com? I can't say that because a computer doesn't understand English or Italian or French or Portuguese or any other language. A computer speaks its own language, and by learning something like Ubuntu Linux Server and by working in the shell where you have to type commands in, you're going to be getting a much more intimate look at how computers function and how they operate. Now, you're not going to be on a super foundational level because the shell, like I said, we'll talk more about the shell later on, but the shell is going to help you out. It's going to take some of your commands and help to interpret that so that the computer knows exactly what you want to do. I think that probably is sufficient for now. We've covered what Linux is. It's a Unix-like operating system designed by Linus Torvalds in 1991. Oh, and I do want to say that although his name is Linus Torvalds in English, in other languages his name is going to be Linus Torvalds. And so there are a few people who want to call the operating system Linux, but Linus Torvalds himself has said the computer operating system he designed is in fact Linux. So it is pronounced Linux, and he didn't actually explain in the video I saw why, but I would think it probably stems from the fact that in Finnish his name is going to be Linus, not Linus, Linux. So Linux is a computer operating system that we're going to be working with. I think you will really enjoy it because, again, it provides this opportunity for you to understand computers in a new way. And you'll start to see why Linux is really growing and a lot more people are using it. One final thing that I want to mention before we go. Linux is an open source operating system. It's an open source project. And what that means is that not only can anyone read the code, the source code of Linux and of the Linux kernel, which is the core. We'll talk more in this next video about the Linux kernel. Not only can anyone read that source code, but anyone can make modifications to that source code and redistribute it, all for free. It's a really powerful platform, open source. In the 1970s and 80s, you had some people saying their projects were open source, but all they meant was you could read the source code. But you weren't allowed to modify it and redistribute it. Today, the open source movement stands for not only code that can be read, but source code that can be modified and redistributed. And that's going to lead us into our next video when we talk about what exactly Ubuntu is.